Okay, hello everyone. With me is Paul Matthews, one of the top-notch consultant on L&D development I met. Do you remember, Paul, how we met and when we met?
I don't exactly, but you do remind me. It's great to be here.
Okay, but I think it was 2019 at some conference in Poland. Do you think it was the
Oh yes,
time
it
we?
was. I was
Yeah.
speaking at a conference in Warsaw. Yes, and you were another speaker there. So yeah, that was
Yeah, it was.
the original time our paths crossed. Yes.
Yeah, all old good times when we had live conferencing and an exchange of knowledge. But on the other hand, thanks to the changes that we are all facing, now we can quite easily meet. You don't need to spend 2.5 hours on the plane to fly over to Warsaw or me to London and then sitting on the bus for some time. So there are some quite advantages
Yeah.
of the situation. And yeah, today we are going to discuss about learning and development in mainly in the organizational setting. We'll a little bit touch, of course, the EdTech environment, but we're going mainly to focus on the organizational setting. So the first question I want you to address is like, what's your understanding of learning and development? Of course, we can find many definitions, but how do you understand it? How do you feel it, Paul?
In terms of learning and development as a function within an organization, well, the first thing I think is it's not got the right name.
Okay.
It should be much more focused on helping people to do what needs to be done to execute the organizational strategy. So there's a workforce planning aspect to that, is how can I help the employees in the organization step up and execute the strategy that has been put in place? And how can we make sure they can do that when we ask them to, and do it reliably and repeatedly on an ongoing way? So L&D needs to be thinking about how those people are performing and behaving at the point of work. And too often, if learning and development is thinking about just learning, they're thinking about learning more in an educational context, which is give people some information and then maybe do a test. Whereas for organizational learning, you have to take it a step further, which is how do we get them to utilize that learning effectively to execute the organizational strategy?
Okay, so I think we have two contexts here. So first is that we want L&D for development of the company or the whole organization, and the second is for development of the skills of individuals. So how do we compromise that?
Well, that's about learning and development. People have to be very aware of what the organization is trying to achieve. So that means being aware of the organizational vision, mission, purpose, and from that will become an organizational strategy. And then from that, you have to develop an L&D strategy to support the people as they execute the corporate strategy or the organizational strategy. So part of that process is thinking, who are we as L&D, as a department? Who are we? What are we here for? What's our purpose? And that means there's got to do something like a value proposition exercise to figure out, what value are we providing to the organization? What do they need from us? And that isn't necessarily what they want from us. What they want from us might actually be not quite, they say, well, we want you to do training. Well, there's actually a lot more than that L&D should be and could be doing. So that's thinking about what value can we provide the organization as a customer of L&D, if you want to think about it that way. And that starts you getting that connection between what's of value to the organization in terms of them getting their strategy executed, and how does L&D need to operate to provide that value to them.
So I understand that with time we can learn that companies do need learning and development of the employees to be more effective. Do you have any proof of that? I mean, I assume there is lots of research confirming that, but from your experience, are there any situations that definitely say that without L&D strategy, the company, I don't know, had some problems over time? And on the other hand, there is a successful company after implementing successful L&D strategy.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot of there has been research done, and there are certainly ongoing projects to measure the connection between learning and development activity and company or organizational success. One of the biggest ongoing measures of that in the UK certainly is what used to be called Towards Maturity, and which is now part of the Emerald Group of companies. And they have been doing these studies for, I think, nearly 15 years. So there's a very rich amount of data to connect companies that do their learning and development well with better corporate results, better shareholder value, better KPIs, and so on. But the issue, I think, for many companies is they don't make that connection, and they get focused on just the learning, and they're not really thinking about how that's impacting the performance of their people, and aren't connecting that all the way through to the corporate results. So there's actually a proportion, maybe a quarter of companies or so, are doing things in a good way, and many others are not. They're still learning, catching up, figuring out what their learning culture is, trying to improve that, and trying to make the connection. So yes, L&D has a lot of work to do, I think, in many companies.
Yeah, well, one of the, I think what you said, it's quite important that at the end, the company wants to develop, wants to get higher value, if it's public, or get more revenue, more income, etc. But it's sometimes quite hard to relate learning of its employees towards actual goal of the company.
Yeah.
So what we do, for instance, in Escola is that every Friday there is 1 hour for development, for internal trainings for the developers. And it's what I observed, is quite hard for me to say whether they are better developers. I mean, because it's such a micro learning, it's just 1 hour out of 40 committed to that. But what I can say for sure, that in 3 years, out of 50 employees, we just lost 3 people, which is quite amazing in this type of industry for software development. So my hard proof for my company would be that good learning and development of my employees helps me to have good retention of people. How do you find that, and are there any key measures that can be used for this type of business?
Well, I think you're right. Employees who feel they are valued, who feel they are given the opportunity to learn, will tend to stay longer in the jobs they're in. So that's all about employee experience and a feeling of employee value that they get. And that certainly is the case if they are given good learning and development opportunities. The other side of that coin is that learning and development helping them be productive for the company? Because you can give someone good learning, but they might not necessarily translate into behaving better or differently.
Exactly. Sometimes they solve some funny puzzles, or they do something not directly related to, I don't know, JavaScript or Java or whatever. Sometimes it's they solve some chess puzzles, or they design some algorithms. So it's sometimes super hard to relate one to another. And the question is, how can we do that? Because very often companies like to, of course, we give some knowledge, then there is a test. If the test is passed over, 50, 80%, then we are happy that they learned something. And this is absurd because, as you said, this is not the aim, that they are very good on solving tests. It's about the skills they have, the productivity. So how can you address that?
I think what learning and development has to start doing is getting closer to the business and having a discussion with the business. I use the word business generically for any organization. And they need to get closer to the business to decide with the business what behaviors are required in order to execute the tasks that need to be executed to do the strategy. And then when you think, okay, so now we have a list of desirable behaviors. This is what we want people doing. This is how we want them to do their work. This is how we want them to behave when they're at their point of work. And then when you have that list of behaviors, you can say, well, that's our output. That's our desired outcome. And if those behaviors are observable, then we start getting to the point where we have a measure. So if we know we want this list of behaviors, and here's the evidence criteria we can use to decide whether we have achieved those behaviors or not, then we have something we can measure. And then given that list of behaviors, if you agree with the business, if L&D agrees with the business, this is the desired list of behaviors, then you've got an output. And then the next question becomes, in effect, what you've done is what you might call a behavioral needs analysis. So it's not a learning needs analysis, it's a behavioral needs analysis. And then you can say, okay, given this agreed list of behaviors as an output, how do we deliver those behaviors to people? Which is a very different question to how do we deliver learning to them or how do we deliver training. So when you're thinking, how do I deliver behaviors, then that will inform you on how to develop a program that will result in those behaviors becoming common and embedded and sustainable in the people in the organization. And it may well be that solving some puzzles, as you said, I mean, some of those things might well increase people's ability to work together, to collaborate, and that will maybe improve the collaborative behaviors that you want your team doing out there when they're building your software. So what you're looking for is what behaviors do we want? And that's an example. I want them to collaborate more when they're working on the code. Okay, let's do some exercises that will help them collaborate. And then we'll see if we get those behaviors. So
exactly.
You've now got an observable behavior that you've got as a measure, and you're thinking, what are the different things that need to be put in place around those people in order to encourage that behavior, to help them experiment, to help them practice it, and to help it become a habit in the way they do things.
And digging into an example of Escola, because it's easy for me to understand and for you to do your consulting job, we do it more on the voluntary basis. So out of 50 people, that it's like once a week you do a presentation or you prepare some training. What is a good solution for it? I mean, some people are quite shy to do that, or they're uncertain about their skills, they're actually not very good in organizing. Sometimes we have hidden talents, that people who you would never say that they would organize a good training. But we really rely on the idea that it's not like always the CTO or CIO creating this agenda. It's always a bottom-up approach. Do you think is it a good approach, or we should create some more of the strategy of it? How do you find it?
Okay, well, my question to you is, what are you trying to achieve by doing that?
That's a strategic advisor. Oh, yeah. What we try to achieve, that's a good question. Is first we want involvement. That's the first thing, and second thing, we want for them to understand the different contexts of IT. So it's not only their little field, what they're doing, but their different parts they take. Because usually when you do a complex project and you are just focused on your narrow field, there is a problem of intersection with other developers, with other employees. And that's where usually mistakes happen, I notice. It's not that, JavaScript developer made some mistake. It's usually because some of the backend is not providing exact response for the front end. So that's where we have problems. And I know it may sound vague, but using these trainings, we want for them to understand they're not alone in the company and in the project, and so that we are working as a team, and empower them kind of to feel that.
Well, now you're starting to get to a point where you can say, given I want these outcomes, what evidence would I see or hear to know that I have achieved those outcomes? And then what sorts of things, exercises, learning, things for them to do, activities, can I give them that will mean they start developing and using those behaviors consistently at work? So you can't really answer a question, is something a good intervention or not, until you've figured out, well, what outcome are you trying to achieve, and how will we measure if we are making progress towards that outcome? And then you can try a few things. Some of it you will be able to say, oh yes, it's pretty obvious. My experience personally is this is a good thing to do to get to that point. Or you go to people who are already good exemplars of the behavior you want and saying, well, how do you think that you got to this point of doing this behavior consistently or working in this? You might not even use those words. You might use words like, how do you get to the point of working in this way consistently? And in this way is collaborating, sharing information. What beliefs do you have? And then that'll start giving you information on what someone is really good at. What do they believe? What's their first step? What's their personal strategy? What's their approach to a problem? Those sorts of things, if you ask them how that happens, and then maybe you ask them to share that or get someone to interview them around those things, and then the person who did the interview can do the sharing, or they can do a joint presentation around that. So what you're trying to do is saying, here's someone who does what we want to do very well. How can we generate that kind of behavior around other parts of the teams, the software teams? But you need a bit more detail to go into that to figure out, the best way forward for that. So,
and tell me, Paul, from your experiences, what's usually omitted in L&D? I mean, what's usually when it's creating strategy? Sometimes it's created internally. I assume sometimes it's externally created. But from your experience, when you come to different companies and you advise them, like, what's usually the first three things that you see that why never someone thought about this?
Yeah. Well, the strategy should be developed internally, although I guess they could get an external consultant to help them. But by and large, L&D should be doing its own strategy. And that will be based against, as I mentioned before, that kind of value proposition approach and who they are, what our purpose is. There's one big thing that's often missing in many companies is there is no L&D strategy. Or there's nothing formal, and their ad hoc or informal strategy is we will respond to the business when the business asks for something, and that's kind of their strategy. That's just not good enough, in my opinion. They need to have a formal strategy and get that agreed and signed off with the business. When they do that, there will be a lot of things that will be specific to their sector, to their industry, to their particular company. But there's usually four things missing that I think are really important in strategies. And they're not the most important things in any strategy, but they're things that I very seldom see. One of them is to focus on doing a proper diagnostics process up front. When the business asks for some training, can we have 2 days of negotiation skills training? L&D needs to say, well, hang on, let's talk about that and do some diagnosis on why this request has surfaced and make sure that training is an effective solution for the problem that seems to be presenting out in the business. So that diagnostics is often not done. And L&D responds to the request. And then, of course, if training was not the solution because the diagnostics wasn't done, then L&D gets the blame for delivering a bad solution. But it was not really their fault, other than the fact they didn't ask enough questions at the beginning. So that diagnostics missing. And the strategy needs to say, we will do a diagnostics process whenever there is a request for training. That's kind of the strategic level statement. The next one that's missing is that L&D doesn't pay enough attention to informal learning. So that's all the learning that happens outside of the formal classroom, outside of the scheduled events and things like that, e-learning and so on. So it's all of the non-formal or informal learning. And most of the learning that happens in an organization in order for people to do their job happens informally. And so L&D needs to be aware of that, and it needs to be harnessing the power of that informal learning. It needs to be supporting it and encouraging it. And too often L&D says, well, we don't know about that. It's over there. It's nothing to do with us. We'll just kind of pretend it doesn't happen and that we are the owners of the learning. Well, no, L&D is not the owner of the learning. The individual learner owns their own learning. All L&D can do is put conditions around them that will help them learn. So that whole ignorance or avoidance or kind of not paying attention to informal learning. It's a bit like the elephant in the room that's there, but nobody talks about it.
Yeah, maybe it's because it's super hard to measure. And when I think about informal learning, it's usually if you go to the live conference, the most things you learn during lunch break or coffee break, discussing with people, other professionals. Some people even say they go to the conferences just because of that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
probably
exactly.
that's I think that's super. Everyone feels, as you said, there is an elephant in the room, but it's super hard to measure. So how to go to the CEO and say, okay, you need to, I don't know, do some project that people can integrate, that people can talk or have a lunch together, because things happen there and you will need a budget for it, etc. Instead of, okay, you give people e-learning, they need to check 7 out of 10 modules. I see you're nodding, so you happen this situation happened to you a lot. Yeah,
there is agreed. There is a bit of a challenge in connecting the dots for informal learning. But if you stop and think about it, the vast majority of learning that happens in an organization happens informally. 70,
exactly.
80, 90%, sometimes 100% for some people. It depends.
So the question is how to get budget for it and how to persuade to the owners or the management that that's what we need.
Well, one way to do that is to think about, well, what happens if our skilled people walk out the door? What are we going to lose? And most of what we're going to lose, if we did a redundancy program and some of our senior people left, for example, with lots of knowledge, and then you could say, well, you could train that knowledge to other people, and then the response will be, well, we don't know what the knowledge is, and it's not really trainable. They learned it through experience. Okay, that's where you can say this informal learning is a really important part of how people prepare and are able to do their work. You might think of it as this informal learning engine that's running in the basement. If you stopped it running, thankfully you can't. The engine will keep chugging along even if you ignore it. But if you did stop informal learning overnight tonight in an organization, the organization would probably fail within weeks or months if nobody was learning anything new about how to respond to the way the environment around them is changing, the way the world is changing. So you've got to help remind people of how important informal learning is amongst all the other learning that's going on. And then there are ways to leverage that and so on, which we haven't got really time to go into here.
We will come back to this topic of informal learning, Paul, but there is also, you mentioned 2 mistakes. So second was ignoring informal learning. What is the third one?
Yeah, the third one is the learning transfer. And this is about when you do a diagnostics process and you've proven through that some kind of learning initiative is appropriate, whether that's training or e-learning or action learning sets or coaching or whatever it is. And then there's not enough effort put into making sure that whatever people learn during that initiative, they transfer and operationalize at their point of work. So this whole concept of learning transfer is taking the learning from a formal setting like a classroom and then actually using it back in the workplace effectively and over the longer term, so it's sustained and embedded into the way that people do things. So learning transfer is another one of the elephants in the room. That's the third one. And then there's a fourth sneaky elephant, and the sneaky ones you got to look out for. So, and by that I mean what I call the brand of learning and development. And this is something that, again, should be line items in an L&D strategy, like the other 3 elephants. There should be something about the brand of L&D. In other words, who are we as a learning and development function? What's our purpose? How do we present ourselves to the rest of the organization in a way that means we can help them? Because if the brand of learning and development is low or not very good, it makes it very difficult for L&D to do its job effectively because people don't hold it with much regard, that it isn't credible as a function. And if the brand of L&D are the other people that do training when we ask them, if that's the brand, then that's really bad. The brand needs to be something along the lines of, well, the other people we go to when we have a performance problem and they help us figure out what's going on. And maybe there's some learning needed, maybe there isn't, but it's all focused around performance and actually stepping up to work on the strategy. So most L&D people I speak with, when I ask the question, could you do more for the organization than you currently do? They all say, oh yeah, I could do a lot more. And I say, well, why not? Well, they never ask for it. Well, that's crazy. Why don't you put it in the shop window? And I say, well, did you want to do more? Oh yeah, I want to do more. So usually L&D people can and want to do more, but somehow they let themselves be constrained by what the organization asks for. But the organization will only ask for what it thinks the brand will provide. So what is the brand?
The question is like, usually people are not probably announcing their success enough. Probably they're not saying what impact L&D has to the organization. And we always have in the departments the problem of scarce resources. So I'm asking you for the quick wins. So for the L&D specialists, or maybe HR managers, or maybe other people who are responsible for this field, what can be done quite quickly? And again, when you come to the organization, very often it is not done.
I think the quickest win is to put in a proper performance consultancy step into the process. So usually learning and development, or as you say, HR that has a learning and development function. So if you have an organization of 50 or 60 or 100 people, there might only be an HR person who has a responsibility for learning on the side. But the quickest win is to put a kind of a filter around the edge of L&D so that the requests for training that come to L&D, the requests for budget for learning and development initiatives, the requests for e-learning have to go through a triage process. They have to go through a process of saying, is this a reasonable request? Is it going to produce value for the organization? And to ensure that consultancy process is embedded in what L&D does. And that way the organization starts getting to know, well, if I go with a request for training and I can't justify it appropriately, I'm not going to get my training. Now that means that L&D won't be doing a lot of training that they don't need to do and never should have done in the first place, because it's got to go through that justification process, that performance diagnostics. What you'll also find with that is it'll throw some of the requests. See, what often happens, a manager in the organization will say, my team is not behaving well, they're not performing well, they're not doing what I want them to do. There must be something broken in terms of the team. There's a problem there. I'll send them to learning and development over there in a different room, in a different part of the organization. I'll throw them over the fence, and learning and development can fix them and send them home. And then they'll be all fine. And of course, I mean, that's at heart, that's what often happens. The manager just expects people to come back from a learning and development initiative fixed. But actually, that's not what happens. We know it takes time for what they learned to be embedded, and that will only happen if they have proper learning transfer initiatives in place as well. But the first thing you've got to do is, when the manager tries to throw those people over the fence, you've got to say, hang on a minute, let's just make sure they should be here at all. I mean, maybe the problems that are presenting are something to do with the environment they're operating within. So a performance diagnostics process will help clarify, why are they not performing or behaving in the way that we want them to? What are they doing now? What do we want them to do instead? And why are they not crossing that gap? What are the barriers to that behavioral change? So this is that behavioral needs analysis. And when you do that, then you can start to say, well, actually, they can't do this behavior because the procedures are wrong, because the IT is not right, because. And then you'll find that actually, most of the time when people are not performing well, it's because the system that surrounds them is stopping them from performing, rather than that they don't know what to do. Sometimes they don't know what to do, in which case you might need to help them learn. But that doesn't also mean a training course. It might be some job aids. It might be some little cards. There's all sorts of ways they can learn things that need to be learned in order to do their job. It might just be working with a colleague on a specific aspect of the job. So it doesn't even mean a training course.
Speaking about tools, very often we think L&D means some e-learning, maybe some skills training. What are the tools in general, or how to find proper tools for learning and development in general? How to seek them?
Well, the first step is to get clear about what your goals are, because just going out and buying tools doesn't mean you fix anything. That's the magpie looking for bright, shiny new objects. And so many people buy learning tech without stopping to think, well, why am I buying this? Well, everybody has an LMS, so we must buy an LMS. Well, hang on a minute. Why are you buying it? What's the purpose of it? I mean, I'm sure you get this with your own customers. They might say, well, this looks really cool. I love this. We'll buy it. But then, well, why are you doing this? What's behind it? How are you going to embed it and join it up with all of the other things you've got? How are you going to integrate it in a way that's actually going to get you the results you want? By the way, what results do you want? And very often they won't be able to tell you. So the first step is to get real clarity over what you're trying to achieve, what behaviors you're seeking to deliver. And then you've got to say, how can we deliver those behaviors? I know it's a really strange thing to say about delivering behaviors, but it's better than saying, how do we deliver learning? So how do we deliver behaviors? How do we get people doing things differently?
Or how we deliver performance of individuals
or
teams.
Yes, but you won't do that without getting people to behave differently or to do things differently. So you've got to look for the performance, and then you've got to back off that and say, well, in order to get that performance, we have to have people doing these things in this way. And how do we get people doing these things in this way? That's your question. And then maybe we can use technology to help them do these things in this way, or maybe we can do it some other way without technology. So starting at the tools end is the wrong end of the journey. You've got to start with your outcomes and then come back. And then depending on how you are going to get people doing these things in this way, you might need some tools to generate that. So, for example, if you want to get some significant behavior changes in things like the way they give feedback or the way they delegate or something like that, chances are that's going to take a number of experiences and practices and things to do over a period of time. Those sorts of behaviors don't suddenly start overnight. It takes time and takes some practice. So what you're going to have to do to deliver those behaviors is to give people a number of tasks to do over a period of time. And while you're doing that, you may well need them, obviously, to do some practice, some skills practice, and you will need to deliver a little bit of content to them to help them do the skills practice effectively. So if you're starting to think we've got to deliver this content to them and it's not necessary for the skills practice, then just, whoa, stop. You don't need that yet. You've got to focus on practicing the skills to deliver the behaviors. And maybe they already know what they need to know. They just need practice, or they need to know it's important to do, and so on. So it's all about coming back and looking at the target behaviors you're looking at, and then saying, how do people typically learn these behaviors, and how can we help people learn and do these behaviors in our environment here in our company, which will have a different culture to some other company. So just because it works over there doesn't mean it'll work here, or vice versa. So talking about tools, eventually you get to that point and you can say, well, in order for that new behavior to occur, I'm going to have to get them practicing that regularly every week for 5 weeks or 2 months or whatever. And so therefore I might well need a digital tool to help generate those activities to practice. So I need to be able to deliver activities to them. And if you think about it, then you're really effectively talking about a workflow tool. And a workflow is an orchestrated sequence of activities that happens in a repeatable way over time. So you can say, if we take these people through that sequence of activities, then almost certainly they're going to get to the other end. And if they follow the activities and do them, then they will get the new behaviors. They will understand them, they will have practiced them, and they'll be able to deliver on them. And they'll know why they need to do it. So that's all the learning transfer levers need to be pulled as well when you're doing that. So that's kind of more like a workflow solution. And that to me is a much better approach typically to changing behavior or learning and development implementation, is to start thinking about workflows over time and programs over time. Don't think about courses, think about programs. And then, of course, you're starting to think about a workflow solution, and our own software heads in that direction. We can do that, but you don't need our software or any tool. You can do that. The problem comes when you try and scale that, of course, is you need to start looking at digital solutions to scale. But the first step is always to figure out what is it that you need to be able to do, and over what period of time do you need to do it. and how can we introduce that to the employees so that we get over that program, we can balance the cognitive load, we can balance the amount of time they're spending at it. So I always tell people, you never ever talk about a one-day training course or a half-day training course. Talk about a 3-day program, a half a day of which happens to be in the classroom, because there's always work to do after the classroom in order to embed it and practice it. So always talk about the longer program and the input required for that.
Speaking about scale, I always wonder between individual and organizational perspective. I mean, very often individual people really want to develop and they want to go to conferences, they want to go to trainings, they really want to develop their skills. On the other hand, it's not usually everyone wants it. So every year in Escola, we have proposals of the conferences or programs that everyone can attend to. And on the other hand, there are people who individually want to go to different conferences, or they want to acquire some new skills. How do you compromise it? Because I always have a problem. First is, of course, the individual programs, usually they tend to cost much more. Secondly, if I have one performing star who goes for 5-6 trainings per year, and each takes a couple of days, well, that costs me double, because first, this person is on the training. Second, this person is not working at the time, but I get more skilled employee. How do you compromise these questions?
That's always a difficult one. There's that lovely old saying is, well, what if we train all our people and they leave? Yeah, well, what if you don't train them and they stay?
Exactly.
I think a lot of organizations I see have a few approaches to that. One is obviously to have some kind of payback clause. So if they get sent on conferences and a lot of money is invested in their development, and then they leave within 12 months, then you want something back from them, from their final paycheck or something. I don't know. There's different ways to look at that. The other one, of course, is to make sure they put together an appropriate business case for what they want to go on, what they want to spend company money on a trip to a conference. What's the business case for that? And that needs to be against that set of behaviors that you're looking for, which means it's really important that you publish that set of behaviors. That you tell people, this is how we want to do things around here. This is our ideal culture. This is what we want people doing regularly at their work. And anything you can do to move us towards that is going to be good. And we're going to be very helpful if you are seeking to improve those behaviors. If you're going to try and learn something else that's kind of not directly in line with those behaviors, we'll think about it, but it's going to be much tougher for us to release budget to do something that's not in the direction we're trying to travel culturally.
And as you said, there is a difficult balance between spending money and keeping people. Is there any algorithm to calculate that? Of course, I'm very mathematical oriented person, so I'm always looking for some algorithm or some
not that I'm aware of. I'm sure somebody's tried to develop it if you searched online, but I don't think that's really that viable. And part of the reason for that is your outputs are going to be varying. So for the next 6 months, we're really interested in focusing on feedback skills, for example, in the organization, so that we get that sorted out. And then if you're somewhat successful in that, you might well say, well, over the next 6 months, we're focusing on something else. So there's one quite large organization I was talking to recently has actually decided to focus on 3 specific soft skills for the whole organization, top to bottom, thousands of people. And that's what they're going to do over the next 12 months, is focus on those 3 things. And they're about change agility and some other things, a couple of other things related to that. And that's what they've identified as the things that are barriers for them and their culture in terms of how they want to move forward over the next few years on the long-term strategy. So they're going to focus on those 3 things. So all of their programs are basically focused on that. And then they will reassess what to focus on next year. So that's really different to what a lot of organizations do, which is say, we'll take a particular level of people like the midline managers and we'll give them general management courses. And it's much more difficult to then measure the result of that, to get to figure out whether it's helpful or not, but it's very easy to do. Whereas if you're focused on just 3 specific observable ways of people doing things,
the big advantage is then that we are spreading the knowledge and skills across.
It's just a very different and interesting model that I've seen only a couple of times, and I was surprised to see it in an organization this big. But that's what they're doing, and I applaud it. I think it's a good approach for where they're at.
And combining those 2 topics we were discussing, so first going to certain skills development sessions, programs, conferences, and spreading the organization. My concern is always that, okay, out of 50 people, I can allow to pay 2 people for certain conferences, certificate, confirming their skills, etc., etc. How can I spread this knowledge? How can I organize this learning transfer towards organization? Shall I organize special session internally so they kind of try to summarize the knowledge they learned over 1 week to everyone else? Or how is it organized typically?
I like the idea of people who are sent away or go away to a conference. I like the idea of them doing internal sessions when they get back. One reason for that is it helps them relearn and rethink about the material they came across, so they get better at it and more familiar with it. There's nothing better than preparing a lesson plan to teach other people something you've learned. That's a very powerful way to learn yourself. Also, of course, when they're doing that, they have to think about summarizing it down to a subset of information that is totally relevant to your organization. Whereas when they were at the conference, it was probably general information across lots of organizations. Or they attended a case study, which was good for that organization, but which factors or aspects of that case study are relevant, here in our organization. So I'm a great fan of doing that. And I think also it's good to then they can maybe work with someone else internally to practice that and then deliver, who didn't go to the conference, and then both of them can deliver that together at a lunchtime session. Or several lunchtime sessions. So it isn't just them doing it on their own, and particularly if they are an introvert and a bit shy and things like that, it may be better to put them together with a colleague, say, well, the 2 of you can, got some time, please develop, some lunchtime sessions around the material, and they can discuss what's relevant and what's not, and come up and maybe even produce some little charts or job aids, and it's powerful. I think that is a process.
And I'm thinking about, you mentioned the word strategy a couple of times, and usually once we have strategy that is developed on usually in management or C-level, then we need a department that's truly responsible for it. So from my experience, usually it's HR, part of HR. But what are the other solutions that you encounter that they are interesting to really enhance the culture of L&D?
Well, I think getting a strategy right or a value proposition right is who are we as L&D? What's our value to the organization? What can we do for them as a customer that will make them have a happy day? And, that's how do I delight my customers? So I think that's really the core. And if you can get to the point where you are providing great value to your customers out in the organization, that's where it comes back to. How you do that will obviously vary a lot from organization to organization. Some will have a lot of compliance training to do. Some will have a lot of mandatory training to do, like in the health sector, for example. Others, like in your organization, most of it is actually more technical knowledge, I would assume, and trying to get that right. There's not much in the way of compliance you need to sort out. So it's going to vary greatly from organization to organization. But L&D, it's kind of, I tell some of them, you've got to learn to live with yourself. You've got to learn to be of value to the world, and particularly your audience. So how can you best do that? And that means you've got to go and act like a marketeer. So how do you market? How do you do a value proposition? How do you develop the marketing for you and your brand? And then how do you protect that brand reputation in the business at all the touch points you have with people in the business? So there's a lot more to that whole brand conversation than I think what people realize.
And coming to the end of our conversation, I really wonder to the more present context of this remote work,
Yeah.
and lack of live conferences and difficulties to organize live session often wise. So it's quite hard to do informal learning now and to organize all those chats that we usually have next to the coffee machine or walking on the corridor. What is your advice to people who, like me now, they have 10% of people or 20% of people going to the office, but the others are, I don't want to say left behind, but we are working on completely different channels. So like chats are more important, teleconferences are huge. How to organize informal learning in this new reality that we have for some time already?
It is a new reality, and I think there's a lot of benefits to what's happened. We've learned a lot of things very, very fast, and I think we're still learning how to use the new way of working. We're still toddlers. We're still learning to walk in this new world. Whereas in the old world, we used to run quite happily without thinking about it. So we've been busted back to being a toddler, and it's a little uncomfortable when we can't just do things automatically. And we're learning how to use this online environment as we go forward. There's lots of people tried lots of different things, and they tend to work or not depending on the culture of an organization. So you might have, at between 10 and 11 every morning, there's a coffee Zoom room open, and people can drop in if they want to. And they grab their coffee, they log into the Zoom room and just talk, or not. And you can obviously make this a personal thing. So there's or you have little interest groups that will get together for your hour on a Friday or whatever it is around a specific topic, and do that. So there's numbers of ways you can do that, but usually you have to prime that. It's seldom that people will just do that themselves. You need to kind of get it going and monitor it and give it some life and momentum, and then it will take off. The people have been doing that in communities long before the pandemic. There's a number of examples in my book on informal learning about how that's happened online in different areas. There's a lovely example from the British Army that I put in that book. So it's not that what we're doing is new, it's just a lot more people are doing it, and they're doing it as toddlers rather than experienced users. So but what the pandemic has done is it's unfrozen the way that we were working. And that gives us the opportunity to remold it in a different shape before it freezes again. My concern often is that we're putting in place, from an L&D perspective, a lot of short-term solutions to deal with the pandemic. And then we're kind of sitting back and thinking, oh, that's done. That's happened. And then, of course, that short-term ad hoc solution just keeps going, and the prototype stays alive for too long. I mean, prototypes they're a prototype. They should be replaced by a production version. So it's about those prototypes being frozen that worries me as we go forward, and the pandemic continues as it is at the moment. And we're likely to do so. It looks like years to come, we're still going to be impacted by it in the way that we can get together or not. And that will also introduce the idea of things like hybrid training rooms, where you've got some people in the room physically and some remotely. And that's going to be a challenge for people. You've also got the challenge of how do we take a program that we were doing regularly in the classroom and making it remote. I mean, we've got one great example of in one of our clients who were doing a leadership program for years with a big government department. And they couldn't do it last year, obviously, in the pandemic. So they converted it onto, it was like 6 days in the classroom spread over, 2 days over, 2 days a month for 3 months. And they changed it to a 6-month program and put it onto our platform. And actually the customers come back and saying, this is working way better than the old one. We'll put another 200 people through this year, please. And we're never going to go back to the classroom one because it just didn't work as well as what you're doing now, in terms of people changing their behavior and this is a relatively senior leadership program, midline to senior line leaders. So you can do that kind of work remotely really comfortably if you know what you're doing and know how to set those programs up.
Amazing. It would be it would it I would say that it good that it happened that we designed all those things. If not that there are some things they are not going so well with that.
Yeah.
Thank
Some
you,
people
Paul.
have really messed up the go remote thing. They've not understood what's required, and they have done what I call a lift and shift job. They've taken a face-to-face training a day long, and they've made a day-long Zoom training. That's never, ever going to work. You've got to repurpose it and redesign it to suit the new context and the new environment. And there's some simple ways to do that. And there's an ebook I put out which actually talks through some of those design considerations on how to redesign training in the new sort of world. And that's available on my website, and you can put a copy on your site as well, or whatever.
Yeah, we will link the book. Thank you, Paul, for your sharing your knowledge with us. I think it was really quite short but in-depth review of how L&D works and how we can develop. Thanks for advice for my company Escola, because it always works quite well if actually a consultant or an expert can actually respond immediately for unprepared questions.
You're very, very well. Very well. I love talking about learning and development, as you can probably see. So give me a chance to stand on a soapbox and I'll be there, because I just want the sector, L&D, to work better, because it's such a powerful part of every organization, but in most cases it doesn't use its power.
Yeah. Okay, Paul. Thanks again. And for our listeners, if you want to have more great stars of education, learning, development like Paul we had today, please subscribe our channel. Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you very much.